As we wrap up Women's Month, we now focus on representation of women in South African higher education. We look into some realities and perhaps some resolutions. Brightness Mangolothi is the director of the Higher Education Resource Services, and she's written quite an interesting article on higher education where she talks about the sector still being dominated by white males, many who occupy management positions. But the question really is, how do we move beyond this notion, and perhaps what and where are the stumbling blocks for us as women to occupy higher positions in the sector? Brightness Mangolothi joins us now live from our studios in PE. Good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you, Palisa.
Now, talk to us about the status quo in terms of representation of women in higher education, and why over 25 years into democracy are we still where we are?
I think maybe to start the conversation is to actually acknowledge that there have been some change in higher education, but a lot still needs to be done. A lot of change needs or intervention needs to be done. But we cannot divorce what happens in higher education with what is happening nationally in South Africa. I think just recently, 2 days back, the statistics on the representation of women across the board in South Africa, it actually reflects what is happening in our higher education. But the question is, what is the problem? Why is there no transformation? Of course, when you talk about transformation, it's about change, and it's uncomfortable for a number of people within organization, more profoundly in higher education. It is a well-known fact that there is an existence of pay gap. When it comes to women, it is a known fact that women are undermined in the workplace. It is a known fact that when it comes to promotion, there are issues that actually impede women from being promoted in higher education. But the big question that we should be focusing on, or things that we need to be looking into, is to drift a bit away from the quantitative factors, but look at the qualitative factor. And when I say qualitative factor, it's about, let us look at the institutional culture. What about the culture of the university that is not welcoming of women?
Would you want to dwell a bit on the culture of universities not being welcoming to women? What exactly are you talking about here?
When we talk about an institutional culture, firstly, when we talk about the culture, it's how things are done. And if you look into South African institution, there is a particular culture. It is very clear that at this particular juncture, it's white male dominated. Some will talk about the boys' club. The boys' club is still in existence in our university. But there is a very interesting narrative that is brought about by Andre Kitt, a professor at the Nelson Mandela University. He talks about different economies that exist in higher education. The first economy one can look into the management, the structure of the institution. If you look at the structure, it's still the same structure that was used in the past. The question is the structure enabling us to transform institution of higher education? Of course, the structure is not enabling for that. If you look at the Senate, which those are decision-making committees within higher education, it's still white male dominated. Of course, when decisions are made, they are going to favor white males more than favoring women per se. But it's also important to understand from an administrative economies, you look at the rules, the laws. Who do these laws favor within higher education? It favors the few. And in most cases, you find that it favors the male. But also there's a narrative that is actually missing. When we talk about women, we normally universalize women as if all women are the same. The reality is that Black women, Indian women, colored women, and even white women have different experiences. And if you look at the hierarchy of women, the Black women are the mostly oppressed in higher education.
And you also bring quite an interesting element into the discussion. A number of women who have obtained their PhDs. Why are we still sitting where we are at this point, Ms. Mangolothi, in terms of women progressing? What are the challenges and where are the challenges?
one of the challenges, it's a known fact that women have families. Although there is a husband and the wife, the woman carries most of the work that needs to be done in the family, as in taking care of the family, ensuring that everything is in order in the family. But if you also look into higher education space, you find that the women who do not have PhDs are actually expected to work at a level where it's either they are teaching undergraduates, and if you look at the pyramid of the number of students, the lower the level, the more students are there. And that actually means there's a lot of administration that takes place, and which actually means women are unable to actually focus on their study because of the massification. There are more students that they need to entertain, that they need to work. The workload is actually unbearable. I mean, if you look into the issues of mental illness, there's a high level of mental illness cases in higher education. And I think that's a conversation that we haven't even begun to have a conversation about.
Now, the prevalence of gender-based violence, we know that our country is also faced with a scourge of gender-based violence, and higher education is no different. Talk to us about this prevalence really within institutions of higher learning.
It's very interesting that only recently Naledi Pandor, that is the former Minister of Higher Education, appointed a steering committee that looks into the gender violence in higher education. And this was actually prompted by women who stood up and said, it's enough. And if you look into the issues of gender violence, probably maybe we need to unpack what is this gender violence. When we talk about the gender violence, it can be psychological, it can be physical, it can also be self-inflicted. And cases of sexual harassment do exist in higher education. Cases of bullying do exist in higher education. And what is important now is that there is something that is being done in higher education to respond to the oppression that women are encountering profoundly when it comes to the violence that they're experiencing in higher education.
Now that we've identified all the challenges, of which some, of course, have been in existence for quite some time now, how do we move forward? How do we go about changing the status quo? How do we go about working on the representation of women in the higher education sector?
I think the first point, some universities have policies that are responsive at being inclusive of gender. But even if there is an existence of the policy, I think they need to be monitoring and evaluation processes. There need to be a commitment in implementing those policies, because it's one thing to have a policy, but it's another to actually commit in implementing those policies. The second part, we have institutions such as the National Research Fund that actually provide funding, and most of that fund is dedicated at uplifting women, ensuring that they get their qualification. But there is a need for more funding. At this particular point, the funding can only cater that much. So the more funding there is, there will be more opportunities that women can actually further their studies. But also it's about understanding the politics of the higher education. One other politics, when we talk about the management economies, it's the committees that exist in higher education, and that stifle the opportunity for women to actually progress when it comes to getting their qualification. I mean, one of the examples that I can use, it's the research committee, and how the research committee can actually frustrate the process, from the process of putting together the proposal, from the process of awarding a qualification. I know a number of cases where people do not have an opportunity to graduate because the committee are indecisive of what needs to be done for certain people or students to be promoted. So the dynamics that we are finding at this particular point is that although women are also employed as staff, but they are also playing a role of being the student, which is a multiple role. And that on its own, it presents an opportunity of oppression. So even if you have an opportunity to voice out your concern, you can't really do that because you are silenced by the fact that you still need to depend on the same people that are oppressing you.
And I suppose the question really lastly is, what's the role of institutions such as the Higher Education Resource Services?
The higher SA's role is actually developing women in higher education. There is a need for more women leaders. I think earlier you asked about PhD. The reason most women are not in leadership position is because one of the main requirements is a PhD. So the SA provide an opportunity where we prepare women for leadership position. In some cases, women are already in leadership position, and we empower them and we give them the skills so that they can be able to lead. One of the examples that I can give you is about career path. The career pathing is where we actually engage women on where am I now, doing a gap analysis and the question of how do I get there. That is, if I want to get the PhD, what do I need to do? Support that is needed, collaboration that are needed. I think doing a postgraduate, it's a very lonely journey, and you need as much support as you can find. But at this particular point, we're just talking about having the funds. There has SA created that platform where women can actually network, collaborate, engage, tap into the experiences of other women who have already gone through the journey.
It is indeed a very lonely, difficult one, in most cases where you have to play multiple roles. You're an employee, you are a mother, you are a wife, you are a student. It's not an easy one, but thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you very much, Palisa.
Well, there you have it. That's Brightness Mangolothi joining us now live from our studios in Port Elizabeth. She's written quite an interesting article on the representation of women within the higher education sector, and of course also talking about a number of stumbling blocks as to why are women not progressing in terms of obtaining their PhDs as well. All right, let's now take a quick break. There's still so much more to come on Your Story. Stay with us.